Hi, this is Debbie from Lime Duty Design, and I am delighted to be joining you here today from the W+9 blog and YouTube channel. If you've been following along with me on my blog or social media, you may have picked up that I've been enjoying playing with gouache. Gouache is an opaque watercolour, and I have been excited to explore the properties of gouache in comparison to my usual watercolours. I've mainly been using a tube of white gouache to mix with my traditional watercolours. My favourite is the Winsor & Newton Permanent White, and I love this so much that the last time I ordered it, I went with the big tube. I use this gouache not only for painting as I've done today, but also it's great for adding white highlights. I find it much more opaque than a white gel pen, for example, and I also love to use it to add white splatters to a background. Having started to use this white Winsor & Newton gouache to paint with, I was also keen to expand my collection and try some colours in tubes rather than mix my own all the time, and I spotted these two sets of gouache from American Crafts in collaboration with Katie Rogers, otherwise known as Paper Fashion. Each set comes in a cardboard box with the colours shown on the front and a description of gouache as being a little more opaque than watercolour but more reworkable than acrylic. That's on the back. Each of the two sets has 12 tubes of gouache with 12 millilitres in each tube, which is a good amount of paint when you're looking at tubes. Set 1 has brighter colours along with a white, brown and black, and then set 2 has a more muted colour palette that appeals to me and includes a grey and a white as well. I'll be using colours from both sets today, but before I jump into painting my card, let's take a look at how gouache compares to traditional watercolours. For this example, I picked two yellow-green colours. For the traditional watercolour, I'll be using Daniel Smith Green Gold, and for the gouache, I'll use the Leaf Green from American Crafts Paper Fashion Set 1. Starting with the Daniel Smith Green Gold and using a wet paintbrush to create a full-strength mixture, I painted a square of colour on Archer's hot press watercolour card. I'm using this particular card as it is smooth in texture, and this is the best for gouache. Having painted a square of full-strength colour, I then painted a gradient of the green gold from full strength to very dilute by rinsing my brush between each stroke to slowly dilute the colour on the brush. I love traditional watercolours, and it is this property of being able to dilute a colour and the translucency of good watercolours allows for other layers of paint to show through. But I'm drifting slightly from my purpose today. We are looking at gouache. And as I mentioned, one of my favourite ways to get a gouache is to mix Winsor & Newton Permanent White gouache with traditional watercolours. So doing this with the green gold, and you can see how the mixture is now opaque. You really can't see the paper underneath. In the same way as traditional watercolours, this mix can be diluted down to create a gradient. Moving on to the American Crafts Leaf Green, and being gouache, this is also opaque. However, I find it a little streaky and not quite as smooth as the mix of green gold and permanent white. Again, this colour can be diluted down to give a gradient. I have found that mixing gouache with, which is a little streaky, with white helps to smooth things out. And so using a little of the Winsor & Newton Permanent White, I did find that the mixture went on smoother. I do love my Winsor & Newton White, and so I'll be using that throughout along with the American Crafts gouache colours. I may also mix a little traditional watercolours where need be to get a colour I want. If you've not tried gouache before, then for the cost of one tube of white, you can mix it with your traditional watercolours for a myriad of new colours. However, if you like the convenience of having some colours mixed for you, then the American Crafts set are a great option at a reasonable price. To demonstrate the opacity of gouache, I painted the four colours of green I'd been using on black card. Daniel Smith Green Gold on its own, mixed with white, then Leaf Green on its own, and then mixed with white. I must admit I was surprised at how the green gold did show up on the black, but taking a few traditional watercolours from my mixing palette and painting those on, and you can see that the traditional watercolours don't really have very good opacity. Whereas if I paint a few similar colours of the American Crafts gouache, you can see that these do show up on black. Now, it's not often that you may want to paint on black, but what this demonstrates is the opacity of the colours, and that means that with an opaque watercolour such as gouache, you can paint one colour over another. I'll come back to this point when I'm painting, as basically it's great for fixing mistakes, if nothing else. Okay, so finally we are getting onto the card making. This is the lovely new home set from W+9, which has matching dies too. There are a range of different images to build a front door scene. I spotted a few great examples using this set where the door is the focal point, front and centre. And so today, to mix things up a little, I wanted to offset the door to one side and include the bench from the set. When I'm scene building, I like to lay the stamps over one another to get a plan as to what is going to go where. This is particularly useful when creating a one-layer stamp scene. I'll begin working out which images are foremost and stamping those first, then stamping the images again on masking paper, trimming the masks out, laying them on top, and then stamping the images which appear further back. Now, as I'm using gouache and the gouache will cover over everything I stamp, then theoretically the stamping and then masking isn't necessary. However, for me to be able to work out where I want to paint, I want the overall image to be as clear as possible without lines overlapping one another. Starting with the wreath, I've kept the door scene in place for now so that I know the wreath is exactly where I want it. Then as I close the door of the Misty, the wreath will adhere to the door. I can remove the other image and now ready to stamp. As before, I'm using Archer's hot press watercolor card for its smooth texture, and I'll be using the Mini Misty to enable me to double stamp each image to get a good impression in the light ink I'm using. I'm going to speed this part of the video up as I continue to stamp each of the elements, masking them where necessary so that the foremost images appear at the front to those further back. Now, if you want to skip this process, you could stamp each of the images separately and use the matching dies to cut them out. Then after painting, you could build up your scene with foam tape and such. I do like the dimension that this type of scene creates, but for this card, I wanted the images to blend seamlessly from one to another, and so it took that extra time to stamp and mask as required until I finally had a full scene all stamped in the light ink and ready for painting. And this is one of the best bits to me, when you've taken that extra bit of effort to make sure something is just right from the beginning and you lift the masks up to reveal that the effort was all worthwhile. Now, although I'm going to be painting the majority of this piece of card, because gouache doesn't require you to use lots of water, then I don't feel I have to tape the card down to prevent it warping. However, I am using the Debby station to keep my card in place and prevent you from feeling travel sick if I was swizzling the card around all the time. I speeded this part of the video up significantly so that I can fit all the footage in, but I'll admit that this did take a while to paint, partially because I'm still new to gouache and so I'm still learning and still working some things out by trial and error, and partially because I'm terrible for fiddling with something until I'm happy with it. However, all the time was worth it because I enjoyed myself and learned a lot from the process, and a bonus was that I like the finished card too. So when I'm painting with gouache, I like to get a block of flat colour down first and then go back in and add shadows, highlights and texture afterwards. At this point, it really does feel like colouring by numbers, where you have a pale outline as a guide to paint and then adding each colour. However, hopefully by the end of this card it will look a bit better than that. That's what all that fiddling around and adding details does for me. It takes it from a flat image and adds life. I mentioned earlier that I'm not using much water with gouache, and I found that the consistency of the gouache is key. If you don't use enough water, then the mixture will be thick, gloopy and difficult to paint with, and lines won't be straight. Not that my lines are normally straight anyway, but it will be harder to get smooth lines. If you use too much water though, you'll lose the opacity of the gouache, and so it's that middle ground that is just right. A sort of light creamy consistency that has the opacity but is also easy enough to paint with. I do find that as the mixture is thicker than a normal watercolour mix, that I need to use a smaller size brush. Here I'm using a size 1 round throughout. I'm going to play some music while I continue to paint, but watch out how the opacity of gouache was key in fixing the plant pot at the front there. When I stamped it, I didn't line it up correctly with the bench, and it appears as if it's floating in mid-air. But once I realised this, I was able to paint over the bench leg to make the pot taller and so correct my mistake. In fact, I quite often painted over areas where I'd gone outside of the lines or didn't like it what I'd put down. Gouache is really forgiving like that. Now you can see what I mean about I can't stop fiddling with things, but I think adding in another flower pot and a plant behind it helped to balance the card out more. Until then, the right hand side was looking a bit lost. After adding variation over the blocks of colour by incorporating strokes of lighter and darker tones, and often with a dry brush to get the effect of texture, I then sharpened up a few of the lines and brought in deeper shadows with Faber-Castell pencils. I will say that I find it harder to be precise with gouache, but I like the more painterly look that I get as a result and need to embrace this looser style more. I finished off the painting with a few highlights with the white gouache and then returned the piece to the Misty to stamp the welcome greeting from the new home set on the doormat in Vesfine Onyx black ink. The greeting was standing out as a little stark in comparison to the painting, and so I muddied it up a little with some paint over the top. I then stamped a coordinating greeting in clear embossing ink on black card and white heat embossed before trimming to a banner with a ribbon end. I then attached this sentiment strip with foam adhesive to the card front and then attached the panel to a card base cut and scored from grey card. And there you have it, a lovely new home scene in a looser, painterly style from Painting with Gouache. On the W+9 blog you will find a coordinating blog post as well as details of the supplies I've used today. If you want to find me, I blog over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.